Between high interest rates and high home prices, the decision of whether to buy a home or rent a home has become increasingly difficult, primarily because of affordability. So let's dive into the pros and cons of each to help you make a decision on which option best suits your needs. Make sure to comment below with any questions you have about your own scenario, and I'll make sure to respond personally. So let's talk about renting a home first. Now, we all know what that means. You're gonna live in a property that you have no home ownership in. You're paying rent to a landlord or to a management company every single month. So let's talk about the pros of renting before we get into the cons. So when you're renting, you have flexibility, right? You're not stuck somewhere more than just the lease term. And even if you do have a set lease term, you can still break that lease, typically with a penalty, but it's minimal compared to owning a property where you'd have to go and sell that home. If you have a mortgage on it makes it even more difficult because that mortgage has to get paid off and you have to sell for at least a high enough price to cover that mortgage if you're selling. So flexibility with renting is huge because you have the ability to move whenever you want, wherever you want, without having to worry about selling the property that you've been living in. You have lower upfront costs when renting. Now, typically when you rent, you're gonna have to give some sort of deposit to sign the lease agreement and move into the property. It can be the first month's rent, it can be first month and security, it could be first, last and security, right? It really depends on whatever you negotiated with the landlord for that property, but it varies. But no matter what, it's going to be lower most of the time than what you would need to purchase a home, right? You need a down payment, you need money for closing costs. So the costs up front when renting are going to be lower than that of purchasing a property. Now, once you are living in a property, the maintenance responsibilities will fall on the landlord, not on you. Most of the time when you're renting a property, you're not the one responsible for the upkeep of the property. Now, I'm not talking about keeping it in a livable condition. I'm talking about if something breaks, like the refrigerator, the oven, you have issues with the garage door or anything along those lines, the roof leak. Those are things that would be covered by your landlord. You're not responsible for taking care of those things as the tenant. Your landlord is as the owner of the property or the management company if you're living in a property that doesn't have an individual landlord but is actually managed by a management company like an apartment complex or so forth. But you're not responsible for those maintenance items. They are. If you own a home, you are responsible for taking care of those things if they ever were to arise. Now, amenities. Now, if you're renting a property, let's just say it's an apartment complex, you get a lot of amenities. You can have a gym, you can have a swimming pool, parks, so on and so forth that you can utilize. If you're owning a home and it's not located within a gated community that has those types of amenities, you don't have the amenities. You have whatever your home can offer, right? And if it's just a single family home and maybe it doesn't have a swimming pool, well, you're not gonna have a park, you're not gonna have a gym, you're not gonna have a pool, right? You're gonna have to go and pay for those things separate from whatever you're paying for to live in that property and own that property. So that's another added benefit to renting. If you're renting an apartment specifically, or you're renting in a condo, right? You most likely have amenities like gyms, pools, and things along those lines, which you don't get with owning a single family home. You also have location flexibility. So this goes back to the flexibility of of renting. We talk about the flexibility of being able to move whenever you want, but you can move wherever you want, right? You don't have to worry about selling as we talked about. You can go ahead and rent in any location that you want to rent in. Maybe you do own a property, but you also want to rent a secondary property and not buy a second home, right? That's always an option as well. Well, you have the flexibility of buying that property anywhere by renting. You're not having to qualify for a mortgage and explain why you're buying the specific location when maybe you work in a different location, right? Those are things you'd have to explain to an underwriter on a mortgage on, maybe you're wanting to rent an hour away from where you work and an underwriter on a mortgage might not understand why or how that would be possible. Well, you don't have to worry about explaining those things if you're renting. So you have the location flexibility with renting as well. Now, let's talk about some of the cons or the negative things about renting. Well, pretty obvious, there's a lack of equity, right? Any money that you're spending toward rent every single month is gone at the end of that month. None of that money that you're paying to live in the property becomes equity in the property the way it would if you own the home, right? A portion of your mortgage payment when you make your monthly payments, and you should check out my video on what's comprised of a mortgage or what a mortgage payment is comprised of, but a portion of that monthly payment is actually principal, which means it's paying down the balance on your loan every month and becomes equity in your home, which is like a savings account. But you don't have that equity when you're renting. Every dollar that you're spending for rent is going toward that rent. It's literally gone at the end of that month. You also have limited control when it comes to the property itself, right? There could be restrictions that your landlord puts in place on that property. This could be with, maybe not allowing pets in that property or not allowing a certain number of cars or a certain type of vehicle to be parked on the driveway if you're renting a single family home, right? So you have certain restrictions that are put in place by your landlord that you might not have if you own the property because because you're making your own rules to live in that property, of course, right? If you want a pet, you can have a pet as long as it's allowed within the community where you live if you own the property. Another thing is you have no tax benefits when you're renting. Now, when you own a property, you have a mortgage on that property, interest on that mortgage, if it's your primary residence, can be tax deductible, meaning it will save you money on your income taxes annually. Well, when you rent a property, no portion of your rent is tax deductible. It is what it is. You're paying your rent, as we said, that money's gone. There's zero benefit other than you having a place to live, right? Which is a benefit. There's no added benefits of renting. You can also have rent increases. This is a huge one. We've seen this over the past few years, that the amount of rent has doubled in some cases for people, making the properties unaffordable, and you're having to move out, whether you want to or not, right? So let's just say you're paying $2,000 a month and it jumps to $4,000 a month because your landlord decided, hey, that's what I feel market rent is. Well, that's up to them. And if they choose to do that, they choose to do that. You have no control over that. So rental amount increases is a huge disadvantage or a con to renting. And there's no long-term stability with renting, right? It provides none at all because, like I said, it's up to the landlord not just to raise the price of the rent, but if they even want to renew the lease altogether, right? How often do you think it happens that the landlord decides, you know what, I no longer want to rent this property, I'm just going to sell it. Or I don't want to rent it to you, I'm going to go and rent this to someone else, I'm not going to renew your lease, right? That creates a level of instability that you get with renting that you don't have with owning a home. So let's get into that. Owning a home. Let's talk about the pros. Well, for one, you are building equity. I talked about with rent how you're not building equity because all of your rent is just going toward the rent and it's gone at the end of the month. But when you own a home with a mortgage on that property, well, a portion of that payment, as I've said before, goes toward the principal on the mortgage, means it pays it down, and that becomes equity in your property. So you're building equity as you make your mortgage payments when you own a property. You have full control over the property, right? You decide what you want to do to it. You know, there was another, I didn't even mention this and I should have with rent. You have limitations on what you can improve on the property, right? If you're renting, maybe the landlord doesn't want you to paint or build anything into it or change the floors. Why would you, right? But when you own a property, you can make any improvements that you may want to. You can paint, you can redo the floors, you can put an addition on the property if you wanted to, you can add a pool, you can do whatever you want when it's your property because you're in full control. You make those decisions. You're also gonna have stable housing costs. I talked about how your landlord can decide to raise your rent on a whim, right? Whenever they feel like doing it at the end of your lease, let's call it. But when you own your property, you have a much more stable monthly payment. It's easier to determine what your housing costs are because you have your mortgage payment, and there's two pieces of that payment that could change from year to year. That's going to be your property taxes and your homeowner's insurance. Outside of that, your mortgage payment itself is not going to change from one year to the next. So it's easier to budget. It's easier to know exactly what your housing costs are going to be. It's much more predictable from year to year. You do get tax benefits. So I talked about how renting, you have no tax benefits because all of your rent is just going toward rent, and there's no portion that becomes a benefit when it comes time to file taxes. But when you own and you're writing off mortgage interest, that reduces your income tax liability, therefore reducing the amount of money you have to pay to the IRS. So there are tax benefits to owning a home versus renting a home. And the fact that you have the property, you have that pride of ownership, right? That you don't get with renting. This is your home. And on top of all that, all the benefits I've already talked about as far as pros of homeownership, the property value in any market is going to appreciate. And even if that's only at 5% per year, you're earning that 5% per year on your property's value on top of what you're paying down on the principal balance. So you're earning equity in two ways: by paying down the balance on your loan every single month when you make your mortgage payments, and by the appreciation in the property's value over time. Now, there, of course, are cons to home ownership. It's not all, going to be rainbows and butterflies. You have higher upfront costs. So I talked about with renting, you typically have to give first last security or some sort of deposit when you sign your lease or move into your rental property. But when you buy a home, you're going to need money for a down payment and closing costs. Now, there are ways to have those things covered, but just in a regular purchase, you do need that money, and that's going to be substantially more than what you would need if you're going to rent a property. You will be responsible for the maintenance on the property. I talked about how your landlord or management company is going to handle any maintenance responsibilities when you're renting, broken appliances, so on and so forth, roof repairs. Well, those become your responsibilities when you own the property. So you need to consider that when buying a home. You also have to deal with market volatility. Now, I did talk about how your home price would appreciate over time. In a normal market, it does appreciate. Back during the housing crisis, we did see home prices fall. That's very rare, but could happen. So there is market volatility depending on if and when you're looking looking to sell your property, there's a chance you could potentially lose money. And that's a risk you don't have with renting. I mean, other than the fact that your money's lost at the end of the month because you paid it in rent. But when you own a property, you are going to be at the mercy of the market and the value fluctuations of property. They're typically up, but they, of course, could go down. You have less flexibility. When you own a property, you have less flexibility of being able to move around without having to sell that property. Not everyone's in a position where they can maybe go buy another home without selling their current home, right? So you're almost more tied down to where it is you're living when you own the home that you live in, because you have to sell that property, and more importantly, you have to sell that property with enough of a profit to cover the mortgage that's on that property. Now, maybe you're not looking to walk away with any sort of additional equity, but you still need to make sure that that's covered after any expenses are paid. So you don't have the same flexibility of just up and moving out of your home that you would if you were renting a property. And of course, you have the risk of foreclosure. Now, no one ever wants to see this happen, but if you ever fell into a financial hardship, you could potentially lose your home to foreclosure if you stop making your mortgage payments. That's just not something that would ever happen if you're renting. Of course, you can be evicted, right? But that's a lot different than a foreclosure. Foreclosure, you're losing the property, any equity you might have had in that property, that you built up over time. And, renting and owning each have their own set of advantages and disadvantages. The decision ultimately depends on the individual and their financial circumstances, their lifestyle, their preferences, and of course, what their long-term goals are. And you need to evaluate these factors carefully before making your housing decision. And make sure to subscribe for more real estate and mortgage videos just like this one.